This is the Earth Pod from TERI. Quite like the Energy and Resources Institute, which engages in multiple facets of sustainable development, from science and technology to policy, this podcast too will steer conversations on issues related to climate change, energy transitions, and environment-friendly growth. Scientists, researchers, and experts from TERI will share their thoughts on the technologies, interventions, and policy directions they are working on to make the planet greener, cleaner, and more sustainable.
In this episode of the Earth Pod, we discuss India's G20 Presidency, the expectation of decisive outcomes, and deeper engagement on areas of energy transitions and sustainable development. In December 2022, India assumed the presidency of G20 from Indonesia. As a key intergovernmental forum that aims to seamlessly bring together 20 of the world's developed as well as developing economies, the G20 is reported to account for about 80% of the global GDP, 75% of global trade, and 65% of the world's population. India takes over the mantle of the forum for a year at a time when the world is fraught with war, economic downturns, and energy crisis. In such a context, how can India steer the discourse on issues particularly pertinent to developing countries and the global south? I'm P. Anima from the communications team from TERI, and I have with me Dr. Vibha Dhawan and Dr. Shailly Kedia, both of whom are associated with G20's Think 20 engagement group that brings under one umbrella think tanks and experts to deliberate on international socio-economic issues. Dr. Vibha Dhawan, Director General TERI, will be chairing the Think 20 Task Force 4 on refueling growth, clean energy and green transitions, while Dr. Shailly Kedia, Senior Fellow and Associate Director TERI, will co-chair the Think 20 Task Force 3 on life, resilience and values for well-being. Welcome to the Earth Pod, Dr. Dhawan and Dr. Kedia. Beginning with you, Dr. Dhawan. India has taken over this G20 baton at a time when the world is particularly polarized by war, as well as energy and economic crisis. And with this presidency, India also seemed to be emphasizing on the goal of oneness, be it of the earth, the family, or the future. I wanted to ask, how crucial do you think is this idea of universality in this fractured world?
Yes, indeed. India has taken over this baton at a critical juncture. The challenge, as you rightly mentioned, are all there. We all know the impact of the changing climate already. So if we go back to the fossil fuels, what's going to happen? On one hand, we are saying that the global temperatures, they must be stopped. And on the other hand, if we are going back to fossil fuels, it's not going to be good for the planet. And we have already seen what is happening due to the changing climate. Last year, it was all over the globe. Whether it is floods in US, whether it is floods even in India, if we look at Bangalore or even Rajasthan. Now, those kinds of things they were never heard of. So the climate change which we were saying is a threat is today a reality. And therefore, it becomes utmost important for the global community that we take care of the planet and we take care of the emissions. And I like to emphasize another factor, and that is the interconnectedness of all of us on this planet. COVID has shown us one thing, and that is that if something happens in one part of the globe, it's going to spread to the other. It's very important for everyone to realize that we have only one planet to live in. And therefore, our actions are to be such that we just don't take care of ourselves alone, we take care of everyone. This Ukraine war, Ukraine-Russia war, what are we trying to achieve? I fail to understand, who will be successful? I have no answer for it. But the cascading effect it's going to have on the entire globe. It's going to range from food security, because even fertilizer is becoming a problem, food production is becoming a problem. So it is not just the impact is not limited to this region where the war is going on, it is to the entire globe.
Right.
Energy crisis, again, not just restricted to Europe.
Right.
It is, India is going to be equally impacted. And then, of course, whenever I see on the TV screen, the kind of emissions, when they do the bombarding, what are we doing?
Right.
So, we are not at all sensitive towards perhaps our next generation. So, the G20, which brings together the world's largest economies, and is, as you rightly said, it accounts for about 80% of the global GDP. It's a very critical platform for discussing and driving change, particularly when it comes to environment and climate and areas I'm very glad that TERI is very deeply involved with.
Right.
Coming to you, Dr. Kedia, importantly, this G20 troika is now traversing through the global south. India has taken over the presidency from Indonesia, and we will hand it over to Brazil later. How crucial do you think are these global south-centered presidencies in not only drawing attention but spurring action on areas of sustainable development and climate change among developing countries?
Yes, it is a very pertinent question, and in fact, it is the first time that there is a troika with all the three G20 countries coming from the global south. And indeed, it is of significance because we are dealing, we are in a time where we are dealing with polycrisis. Of course, with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, there is a lot of attention that is being diverted to the conflict situations. However, when we talk about climate change, sustainable development, these are very pressing issues where the world is really sort of faltering behind. And because the troika is now led by the global south, it is in many ways a golden opportunity for pushing forward for larger normative leadership from the global south, so that issues that pertain to the global south are considered by the G20. So, typically a lot of what we talk about is in international relations is there are countries that are norm takers, but then there are countries that are norm makers. And because G20 is such an influential forum, it is time that global south take on the role of normative leadership and put in place norms and values, which in turn leads to international mechanisms and eventually implementation that benefits the global south. And definitely because the global south is most impacted by climate change and is also, it also needs to make a lot of progress on sustainable development indicators. These are the areas which the global south must focus on.
So, Dr. Kedia, what you had suggested is like a normative shift in approach of the global south becoming a norm maker. And what will be the areas to focus on once you kind of take on this role?
See, typically if you see, for example, even in climate change, much of the discussions or the dominant discourses have been dominated by climate change mitigation. There is very little focus on adaptation. There is very little focus on loss and damage. When it comes to climate finance, there is just talk and there is no money. So there are these areas, where the global south needs to really take on collective stance in the G20 forum and advocate that there are important areas such as means of implementation which is not receiving enough attention, nor are there at the global level goals, targets, indicators to measure these and to take a more informed conversation in these areas. The whole discourse right now, if you see from the developed countries, is all the G20 countries are equal. But if you look at the per capita emissions among G20 countries, so countries like India is really it's at the lowest. It's lower than the world average. You cannot put everyone on the same boat. The other normative area is going to be lifestyles, which India has taken as one of the priority topic.
Right. Dr. Dhawan, G20 as a global platform brings together very powerful entities, especially very powerful economic entities together. And they have a critical role to play in driving clean energy transitions. As the chair of T20 track on refueling growth clean energy and green transitions, what do you think are the likely areas of focus for this task force?
The G20 accounts for the consumption of more than 2/3 of the world's energy. So, to a large extent, the burden of making that consumption clean and green does indeed rest on G20 countries.
Right.
The Bali Declaration addresses the issue of volatility in energy prices and markets, as well as that of shortage and disruptions to energy supply the world is currently faced with.
Yes.
The declaration also underlined the urgent need to transform and diversify energy systems, advance energy security and resilience and market stability by accelerating and ensuring clean, sustainable, just, affordable and inclusive energy transition and flow of sustainable investments.
Right.
The path for the T20 task force on clean energy and green transition is fairly cut out.
Right.
The transition to clean energy needs to involve all stakeholders, from individual to the community, regional, state, national, as well as at the global levels.
Right.
And when we talk of I always say that as stakeholder, it's all of us.
Right.
Every individual is contributing to climate change, and every individual on this planet gets impacted due to the changing climate. Like when we talk of clean energy, I'll say even at the rural level,
Yeah.
isn't it somewhere its duty? And of course, our Honorable Prime Minister, he took the initiative of giving LPG to the village communities. But there is much more apart from that, much more, because it's not just cooking. They also have other energy requirements,
Yes.
which involves even, I should say, cool chambers for keeping their perishables.
Yeah.
It also includes running their tractor.
Yeah.
Can we think of taking care of the agriculture residue at site,
Yes.
produce CNG, which is used by them? So it is decentralized clean energy production, and that actually takes care of everything, because it's taking care of pollution, because you are not burning the agriculture residue. It is ensuring energy security. So rather than just being a food producer, they can process their food. Their lives will become simpler.
Yeah.
And perhaps we also have to look into how do we compensate them?
Right.
Can we also give them carbon credits for their efforts? And it goes, I should say, to the large industries, because for them also it is important that they go clean as much as possible. But that is what one would like to do in T20. Like, where are the innovative ideas?
Right.
What is it? What kind of awareness is required? How to go about technologies which are available? How can those be scaled up?
Yes.
What kind of technology, new technology introduction must be made? It might be expensive to start with, but there are going to be economies of scale.
Yeah.
What kind of research initiatives we should take? So those are the things which I personally feel, because T is think. So we have to think about innovative ways and new technologies under this particular task force. And the other is that we are today talking largely about technology transfer from other countries. My message to them will be, yes, they have invested a lot of money, and therefore IPRs are very important, but at the same time, please realize that we have only one planet to live, and therefore you cannot afford anyone not to go for green technology. And the other is that let's also look into technology development as co-partners.
Right.
Because none of the technologies is going to be something like plug and play. India is a country of small and medium enterprises, and those technologies cannot simply be used by them. So co-development of technology becomes extremely important. And another factor I would like to say is the human resource development, because if you go for new technologies, you want a different set of manpower. So therefore, when I say skilling, it starts from, I should say, the person who will be dispensing hydrogen to the level that you do innovations for technology development. Also the cost of technology, it should become affordable. So therefore, it's the range, it's right from the postdocs to a school dropout that need to be trained for adopting the new technologies.
Right. Coming to the task force that you are co-chairing, Dr. Kedia, of Task Force 3 on life, resilience and values of well-being. Looking at the G20, it comprises entities which make up the largest chunk of consumption globally. What are likely to be the challenges in introducing and probably maybe finding takers for this idea of mindful consumption? Because there also rests an inherent irony in the scenario, isn't it?
Yes. Firstly, I'd just like to introduce to the audience as to what is this Think 20. In fact, it is one of the three work streams of G20. And Think 20 is part of the third work stream, which is the engagement groups, which is more like you get different set of stakeholders, and Think 20 is led mostly by think tanks. And yes, the task force, and it has 7 task forces, and the third task force focuses on life, which is lifestyle for environment, a movement which was an initiative which was announced by the Prime Minister of India at COP26 in Glasgow. And also, I'd just like to say that the task force has actually 3 segments. One is lifestyles, the second one is values and ethics, and the third one is resilience. From a researcher perspective, when we look at resource value chains, you have the upstream part and then you have the downstream part. The upstream part considers like resource extraction, and then you take it, you process it, you produce products from it, and then when you come to the downstream part, then there is the consumers, and then finally the waste disposal and management, recycling, etc. So typically, if you see when you're talking about barriers, for this particular concept, and of course definitely from India's standpoint, and you can see that very evidently that it is one of the central themes of India's G20 presidency. When we look at resource value chains, developed countries typically have been focusing more on the production side, because that is where they can profit from, because that is where new technologies come in, which can be patented or which can be transferred, and there are economic benefits from that. But when you talk about the downstream or the consumption side, that is not where developed countries usually have focused on. They've just focused more on the production side, because they know they are pretty advanced in their green technologies. They can make those choices, and they can even, like, their markets can actually profit from the production side of the value chains, of resource value chains. But consumption side, when it comes to that, there is there was this time when President Bush Senior, he came at climate negotiations and said that the American lifestyle is not up for negotiations. So there is a certain attitude in not, like, I won't say that in all political parties, but there are certain political parties where they sell to their citizens that you have to have a luxurious lifestyle. And that's an area which a lot of the developed countries have typically been sort of resisting even in the past. I think it's a very welcome step that that India has taken a lead on the consumption side. But here again, the idea is that this has to indeed develop into a meaningful global movement, not just comprising of citizens, but indeed of policy regulatory measures, and to some extent even influencing or regulating market forces, for example the advertising sector. There has to be for example norms that can be pushed for responsible advertising.
Dr. Kedia, you kind of highlight a very significant point here, the role advertising as a sector can play in driving life as a movement. And you're calling for accountability from that sector, and that immediately changes the dynamic of it. When you bring in market forces into this discourse, what are the challenges in bringing that angle, the advertising angle, to this discourse?
So when we talk about sustainable lifestyles or responsible lifestyles, the end consumer is core to that. And when we talk about consumption choices or buying choices, we all know, I know that that there are various sources of influence when we make those choices, and one can't deny that when we look at advertisements, and that's one of the sources where which is a source of influence that influences consumer choices. So the thing is that right now, when we largely see the narrative around lifestyles, a lot of it is linked to, firstly, like creating social movements, and then creating certain policy instruments like eco labels. But however, a lot of the burden and the onus actually lies with the consumer or to some extent governments. But it's high time we get these market players in, especially the advertising industry. Right now, when we look at the life narrative in India, we are only looking, we are definitely, it's not that it's not considering market elements, market forces, but only to the extent that it is driving innovations, and it is it is also driving it is also going to be a driver for new entrepreneurship for promoting sustainable consumption. So that's very, very important as well. But I think the biggest chunk of the puzzle really is the advertisement industry. And if G20, the communique, or if it comes, if it proposes that there has to be a G20 coalition on responsible advertising, this is a concrete outcome which we are talking about.
Dr. Dhawan, as the head of an organization that has played a very pivotal part in clean energy, innovation and technologies, what do you think are the key challenges in mainstreaming energy transitions? And how can platforms such as G20 help address and mitigate these challenges?
Well, as some of you might be aware, TERI, we were established 48 years back by Tata Group of companies, and of course the discussion Mr. J.R.D. Tata and Darbari Seth, they had was to set up an institute which will work on the problems that mankind is going to face in the future. And at that time, no one was actually talking about energy, but TERI was established to work on renewable energy. Right. Of course, as we grew, we also looked into other problems like food security. We started on biotechnology and so on. But the initial objective was to look into options of clean energy. I'll just like to touch upon another milestone, and that is in 1997, when the world was, or India was talking about development in first 50 years of its independence. TERI, with support of the corporate sector, had studied that what have we lost in terms of climate, in terms of soils and so on. We've studied further and said that what are going to be the sustainable means. How can you grow? Because you will never say development should stop. It is that development has to continue, but in a mindful way. You have to look into that it is sustainable. And when we are talking of the transition to clean energy, it is in the heart of India achieving its NDCs as per the Paris Agreement. Right. And apart from working extensively on renewable energy technologies, we also work deeply on areas of industrial energy efficiency and even energy access. I can mention that the industrial energy efficiency, so TERI routinely does audit, and we tell them how can you go about, and it's again not restricted just to industries. We are also looking at sustainable buildings, and some of you may feel surprised that by efficient building designing itself, you can reduce the electricity load as much as 45%. I should say, like TERI's core value is sustainability. And therefore, we look at energy in a very big way. Now, the challenges in mainstreaming transition are multi-pronged, ranging from technical to policy to implementation. India has committed to being net zero by 2070 and also raising our renewable energy capacity to 500 gigawatts by 2030. So, these targets are set and announced by the Prime Minister in Glasgow. And now it is that we have to work towards them. And whatever are the roadblocks, we have to sort them out. And as I said earlier, an important point that remains is related to technology transfer and even carbon financing, because the capex many a times is much higher and many industries are not able to afford that. So, what we are discussing in COP all the time about the capex or the carbon fund, that is actually required by growing economies. As I said, we are growing. We can showcase new technologies. We can show to the world that the green is possible, but we also need initially support to be able to afford these technologies and also access to technologies. So, that becomes very important. And surely the policy instruments are also required so that we give incentives to those who are going for such transition. And as I said, that maybe initially it will be expensive, but the economies of scale will surely make it possible that green is as expensive or perhaps cheaper than the energies that we are using today. The way those are energy generation today, it's going to be reduced, and we have seen the example of solar. So that's going to come, and who knows, like in years to come, hydrogen, which is expensive today, so if it becomes affordable, perhaps the fossil fuel, whatever we have, will remain under the earth. We are never going to extract that. So let's work towards these technologies, because that's how everyone will come together, everyone will put their brains together, both for the technology as well as for its adoption.
Dr. Dhawan, again, it is imperative for transition to clean energy to be equitable, just, as well as inclusive. And probably looking at this transition from the perspective of gender, what are the key areas that you would like the task force to look into?
Yes, there is an urgent need for what I call a normative shift on discussions on clean energy. The discourse on energy transitions needing to be just has gained considerable momentum over the years. But equally, it also needs to be inclusive and responsible if we want to succeed. And there is a critical need for gender to be part of the energy transition discourse. The role of women, whether in leadership role or as beneficiaries, demands specific approaches, and that approach will have to be mainstreamed in the meaningful manner. Even in this dynamic, the focus is often on the supply side, while it is imperative to focus on demand aspect as well. So there's a lot of scope, and I'll just would like to mention what TERI has done in the past. We talk about pollution. Somewhere we forget what is happening in the kitchen in a rural area. First of all, women has the burden, women and maybe even girls, young girls. So right from the beginning, they'll go to collect firewood from the forest, and thereafter cooking is something that they are supposed to do. Can't we help them improve cook stoves so that the indoor air pollution gets reduced? Simply putting simple things like chimney, and around chimney you can heat water for meeting your daily requirements, and then there is no smoke in the kitchen. So otherwise, look at those ladies, because whether they are expecting a baby, whatever stage they are exposed to those fumes all the time of poor quality firewood. So that is where the society as such needs to be sensitive towards the workload, the work which they are doing, and how to make it clean. So it starts from that level, I'll say, to all the way. Like I always say, even the big car manufacturers, of course that has nothing to do with the energy, I'm just talking of the gender, they are not sensitive towards what kind of seat belt women will be comfortable with. You talk of tractors, they all are somewhere, all your farm machinery, while women are contributing at the farm level, it's all to heavy machinery, which is very difficult for women to run. So therefore, in all aspects, we have to ensure that they are 50% of the population. And therefore, let's our R&D also should be towards how do we make their life simpler. Their needs are different. Please recognize the work which they do are different. So we have to work in that direction as well.
And Dr. Dhawan, it's a very pertinent point that you've raised here about, the aspect of gender when it comes to R&D, and even how R&D needs to be more inclusive. Probably an area where we've not given much attention so far. Dr. Kedia, life has been conceptualized and promoted as an indigenous idea that needs to be scaled up, where the onus is as much as on the individual as it is on the community. What are going to be the key areas of engagement for Task Force 3?
Yes, so definitely, when we talk about lifestyle and when we talk about, India's narrative on lifestyle, a lot of it is also about traditional knowledge, and the fact that there are many traditional communities in India that have this TK, or what we call as traditional knowledge, and which inherently is sustainable because in many ways they follow the very basic principles of living in harmony with nature. So definitely traditional knowledge and traditional way of living is going to be a very important focus. But also as part of this task force, as you know, that one of the aspect is resilience. And this is also an important aspect when we talk about traditional communities, because they have an inherent way to deal with, weather extremes and also, adapt in that sense. So when we talk about lifestyles, the dominant Western conceptualization of lifestyle is more towards, if you were to put it in the climate change context, it's more towards mitigation. But when we would bring in the traditional aspects, they'll really show that, how lifestyles also have to be adaptive, and how adaptation has to be an important part of sustainable lifestyles as well as resilience as well.
Dr. Kedia, considering the concept of life as not a standalone, but one that has, is intrinsically linked to sustainable development and climate change, what do you think can be the effective recommendations emerging from Task Force 3?
See, one recommendation, I think, there should be a G20 coalition, that should be formed on sustainable lifestyles itself. That coalition should work towards getting more actors on board, essentially, whether it is market actors, whether it is state or government actors, as well as the non-state actors. And so I think that is definitely one. I think there could be one outcome around that.
Right.
And the other thing is that this particular coalition should also work on further internationalizing lifestyles. So, for instance, even when we talk about SDG 12, which is supposed to be the SDG on sustainable consumption and production, is supposed to deal with lifestyle. It does not have a single global indicator framework. It does not have the global indicator framework does not have a single indicator that focuses on the downstream segment or lifestyles. Right. So there are these changes which, as a influential global community, and through this coalition, they can advocate for these kind of changes as well. As well as lifestyles, for example, when you mentioned climate change, this is something which can be given as a mandate for some technical work to the substa, which is one of the technical bodies under the UNFCCC, under which a lot of discussions take place. So right now lifestyles is not even adequately covered under sustainable development, and even despite the fact that IPCC clearly highlights lifestyle as one of the measures to deal with climate change, it's certainly not dealt with with a lot of seriousness, even in the climate change discourse. You see the latest COP27 outcome document. It merely notes lifestyle, so the language is pretty weak. So this coalition has to work on that. The second thing on the at least this is really like just my expectation as a researcher, this is not coming from the task force, should be that there should be a coalition, G20 coalition on responsible advertising, because that is a very important sector to also tap. So that is there. And the third aspect I think is that we must have a very strong research engagement amongst institutions from G20 countries to see various facets of lifestyles, including traditional knowledge, including adaptation, including what influences behavior. So this has to be a very multidisciplinary kind of partnership that should emerge from this particular focus area of the present G20 presidency.
Dr. Kedia, you raise a very interesting point here about maybe having a coalition that brings under its umbrella even traditional knowledge aspects. But when we look at G20, it's a very heterogeneous entity. Like, you have developing as well as developed economies, and you have countries that are scattered all across the globe. So how difficult, or is it easy, is it going to be to kind of bring these different entities together?
Yeah, so this coalition, was more in the sense of researchers, non-state actors coming together as well. So the thing is, the idea of a coalition is not necessarily that all the actors or all the constituents should be sort of homogeneous, but it is also important that people coming from different perspectives share their viewpoints, and somewhere there could be some common values that would emerge from there. It is very important that lifestyles, that the entire burden of action should not be there on the individual. I mean, it needs to involve other actors, including communities, but more importantly the states and markets. So it's very important to get these different actors together. But here, from a research perspective, I do think there are several aspects which can drive sustainable lifestyles, but more so a mindset change. So one of the things, for example, this task force, if you look at the other theme about values and well-being, it will also push for innovations like green GDP. So these are also important concepts which can bring about a larger mindset change in the policy making, but also in the markets.
That brings us to the end of this episode of the Earth Pod from TERI. And thanks a lot, Dr. Dhawan and Dr. Kedia, for being part of this episode and sharing your insights on the task forces that each of you are part of. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anima, for having me here at the Earth Pod.
Special thanks to Dr. Vibha Dhawan and Dr. Shailly Kedia. The Earth Pod from TERI was scripted and hosted by P. Anima. Audio coordination was done by Shreyas Joshi and audio mixing by Rumpa Banerjee. Creative content creation, social media engagement and monitoring were done by Palak Khanna and Vidushi Pathak. Thank you for listening to the Earth Pod from TERI. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts and YouTube.